So in our talk, first point about cutting quality, these are some other types of gem cutting machines and techniques that are used in different parts of the world. This over here to the left is freehand gem cutting, and that is a very ancient technique. You can see that this is even a hand-powered apparatus. It doesn't even have electricity. I think he's got it like a bow and is making it move by hand power, spin. That is not used very much anymore. It is very hard to place many facets freehand. Usually it's only used for gems with larger facets or cabochons these days. These over on the right hand side are cutting techniques that are still used a lot these days, although they are also very old techniques. This up here is a jam peg cutting machine. These are common in Germany, Brazil. Variations of them exist in France and Thailand, but I go to Brazil a lot, so I'm very familiar with the Brazilian models, which have a slightly different piece of wood here, but the concept is the same. They have a piece of wood with a bunch of holes in it, and then you can kind of see the dop here. The stone is glued onto the end of a wooden cylinder with a pointy end, and that pointy end is jammed into a hole. So it's a peg that's jammed into a hole. That's why it's called a jam peg. And the hole that it's jammed into controls the height and therefore the angle, more or less. So as the cutter wants to change angles, he changes holes. And to rotate the gem, he just spins it in his fingers. He's holding the rotation with his fingers. And this is a Thai style handpiece. As I said, Thais also use the jam peg, but this is a very common style in Thailand. Unfortunately, the picture wasn't big enough to show the back end of it, but the back end has 2 feet, which supported on the table, and the front end is supported directly on the gemstone, which is on a dop, and the dop goes through some wrapped up cigarette paper or similar type of paper, and it's attached by tightening this wing nut, and then the gem is set against the lap. So to change angles or to rotate the gem, they just loosen the wing nut and twist it. They twist it radially to turn the gem, or they pull this up or down to change the angle. So those are, especially these two, are quite common cutting techniques in other places of the world. When compared to an American style cutting machine, these other techniques have some advantages, which the primary advantage is very skilled jam peg cutters can sometimes turn out anywhere from 12 to 30 stones a day. And my average is closer to 1 stone a day. So that is a certain advantage. However, there are certain disadvantages also to these other cutting techniques. One of which is, remember how I was saying how the radial control is done by the fingers? Well, fingers are soft. So when the gem is pushed against the lap, the fingers naturally give a little bit, and the gem ever so slightly rotates, which tends to result in rounded facets. Also, another issue with both of these cutting styles is you don't really know what angle you're at. You know, experience can tell you a lot, but it won't tell you even down to a degree. You know, you may be within 2 or 3 degrees of where you plan on being. But even if you always use the same hole, for example, in a jam peg, the distance, the length of your dop and stone together will make it have varying angles, even if you always use the same hole. A bigger gem will sit up higher. A smaller gem will go down lower. And if your dops even vary the tiniest bit in length, that'll change things too. So the angle is not as precise. But as I said, with precision, we pay in speed. The speed goes way down. And also there are different factors such as the kind of polish used, the grade of polish. I'm kind of a perfectionist, so we use a very fine grade of polish, which is also a slower process. The results of jam peg cutting is this. This is the pavilion of a blue topaz. And as you can see the light reflecting off of this facet, see how the juncture of the facet is sort of curved? It sort of curves there and curves there. And this other one, that's what I was talking about with facet rounding. When the fingers are flexing, the facet ends up being rounded. And another thing is, since they are forced to or encouraged to go extremely fast on machinery that is not exceptionally precise, what happens is often a lack of symmetry. These facets are intended to be the same size, but this one is much larger. As you can see, it's eaten more of the girdle than this one has. This facet is supposed to be this facet on the far left is supposed to be the same as the facet on the far right. And that they weren't, unfortunately, because you can see the girdle got really thin there, thick here, and thinner over on the right. I'm hoping everybody's seeing my mouse, because if not, that could cause some trouble.
You can see.
Okay. So we have rounded facets, irregular facet shapes and sizes. And another thing that I was talking about, this is an example. I hope you can see that little white lines on these facets. This is, in this particular gem, this is a case of being cut and the polish being applied very rapidly, but not long enough to remove all of the subsurface damage from the original cutting disc. And that's a blue topaz. And one of the reasons I'm picking on blue topaz is because one of the few gems I purchased cut to recut, so I have examples to show. And what difference does that make? Well, this is the same stone. On the left was the stone as I bought it, planning on recutting it. And you can see it has sort of a grayish cast, and you can even see the facet ripples on it, the different striations and lines on the facets. And this was after recutting. Now, two things changed: the quality of cut and the style of cut. And that is a considerable difference to my mind. And I love gemstones. I love gem rough. And to me, it is often really sad how gems are cut and how they end up looking when they could have been really beautiful. Now, when you're buying gemstones or looking at gemstones, something that often is not looked at but should be looked at is whether the girdle is straight. As you can see here, this girdle goes along, wanders up, and then wanders back down. Now that's because of slapdash cutting. But why does it matter if it looks okay from the front? Well, it matters because goldsmiths are going to have to set this. And if they set it with prongs or a bezel, they're going to have to cut a little notch in the prong or bezel. And it's much easier to cut what they call the seat of the gem level than it is to follow a girdle that goes up or down. What happens often when the girdle goes up and then back down is if the goldsmith doesn't support the gem perfectly by cutting it at the right height, then some of the girdle doesn't get supported and pressure is applied on the top, the gems here, and the seat, it's not quite sitting on the seat, but the prong is pressing down from the top and there's no support. So that often causes gem breakage while setting. This is ideally what your girdles should look like. They should be straight. Now they don't have to be faceted. This is a faceted girdle and this is a rounded girdle. That doesn't really matter. What you want though is you want a girdle that is straight. And I mention this because people tend to look at the front of the gemstone, sometimes they look at the back of the gemstone, but often they don't look at the girdle of the gemstone. Another consideration is if the girdle is knife edge. I've seen this a lot with tanzanites cut in Tanzania, where they just didn't put the girdle on. The top facets meet the bottom facets at a very sharp point. And the problem with that is when the prong presses against that sharp point, especially in a fragile gem like tanzanite, it tends to chip. So when you're buying gemstones, always check the girdle and keep in mind whether it's straight, whether it's knife edge. And another thing to keep in mind is, which I don't think I mentioned in my slide here, is whether it's too thick. Now this visually to me is a good thickness here. You see that white part shining? That's light reflecting off the girdle. If that were 3 or 4 times thicker, that would also present some challenges for cutting. Not for cutting, sorry, for setting. So another comparison here. I just want to say I'm showing these different comparisons to illustrate the difference that cutting makes. But what I do is I cut gemstones for sale on my own website, johndyergems.com, and I don't offer cutting services. That's a question I often get asked after showing recut pictures. If you really need to have something recut, I can try to refer you to somebody, but I don't have the time for doing that. And I also enjoy having less stress by cutting my own material. If I break a $10,000 piece and it's mine, it's much less of a big deal than it is if it's yours. So this is an Imperial Topaz. Usually I don't buy more valuable gems as cut gems because it doesn't give me the flexibility that rough does, and often also the cost isn't justified. But this particular Imperial Topaz was a good enough deal as a cut stone that I did purchase it. And you can see that it has a window, a lack of brilliance right here. You can see it has polish lines right here. And you can see that it's not symmetrical. The bottom is lower here and higher over here. And some people would say, oh, that's because the cutter wasn't experienced or they were slapdash or whatever. But the reality is on this is expensive material. In all likelihood, the cutter knew what he was doing in this case. He was probably trying to retain the absolute maximum amount of weight because 10 points can be a lot of money in Imperial Topaz. Also, from the end, viewing it from the end, the pavilion was off center to one side. So I recut the stone, and after recut, I made it symmetrical, very symmetrical. You can see both sides are the same from both directions. Okay, so after recutting, you can see how the polish is very smooth. Also, as you look at the lines between facets, you'll also see they're slightly bowed here. And here they're very straight, where each facet joins another. Okay, and the result is much more brilliant. But I lost a lot of weight. It went from being a 3.91 carat stone to being a 2.30 carat stone. That's 59% yield, which is not exceptionally good, but it was necessary due to the lack of symmetry and the fact that I wanted to close up a rather large window on a stone that was not very deep, and I wanted to do it in a way that was very brilliant. So sometimes when people are looking at, oftentimes in fact, when people are looking at a well-cut gem, they look at the per carat price and say, but that's more expensive than I can buy it over there for. And this is something I wanted to point out here. This is a 3.9 carat stone, and this is a 2.30 carat stone. So in my opinion, I did not lose more weight than needed to make it as beautiful as possible. But I lost 41%. So even if this cut stone is 41% cheaper than this stone when you find it, this, in my mind, still represents a better deal because you don't have the risk involved in recutting, and also you see what you get. You see what you get when you're getting it. This asymmetry, you know, some people will also say, well, what does that matter? That's just on the bottom of the gem. Well, the difference it makes is this part being deeper and this part being shallower is that not only do you have a window, but you have sort of a pear-shaped window. You have much more of a window where the gem is shallower and a narrower window where the gem is deeper. So this is another example of a recut. This is an inexpensive material. This is a oro verde, green gold, lemon citrine, a rose by any other name. They're all the same kind of, it's a irradiated quartz found mostly in Brazil. And the cutting before had a certain amount of asymmetry to it and poor polish, a little bit of a window. And after, it's much brighter. And it's interesting to note that even the color is brighter. This is the same photography, our photography in both cases. On this one, since it was an expensive material, especially, I did not prioritize yield by any means. I went for maximum beauty. You can see I actually lost over 50% on this one. I will say that there are certain gems where I get very close to the right proportions and I lose less than that. But this is an extreme example. And I think it's very important to note the difference in color, because another thing that people often say in regards to cutting in colored gemstones is, well, cut really isn't important. What's important is the color. Well, the cut matters a lot. When it comes to the color, you can see that it has sort of a grayish tone to the stone and it lacks in brilliance. The color becomes purer. And why does it become pure? Because the surface before looked like this. As you can see, it has a poor polish with lots of scratchy lines in it because it was done very quickly using a coarse polish. And after, it's extremely smooth and without any lines in the polish. And this difference, combined with the proper lines, the proper angles, and the proper design, resulted in superior color.